Welcome back to the Berg podcast. Thanks for joining us today. With me today is Ford.
Hey, how's it going?
And Dan.
Hey, everybody.
And we are talking about the book today. So was it last week's episode? Last week's episode, we talked about a book we had read about 10 years ago called Right Away and All at Once. And we've kind of each had a chance to dig back into it a little bit. And we're going to talk through kind of what hit us the most, what we had forgotten, or maybe all of it, and kind of get a sense of where each of us are and what might come next. So
I'll start with, the funny part is a couple of things. Like we just read like the introduction or whatever. It didn't even get into the steps yet.
Yeah.
But two of the main things, like I remembered certain things from the book, but what I didn't remember was the beginning. I remembered stuff later on. Like that's some of the things that we like still talked about, but it really fired me up. And it also was like, okay, this book can't be left on a shelf for another 10 years. Like something about this needs to be reread or remembered every 18 to 24 months at maximum. Like it just was like, boom. And it really like, get going. Like that's, the drain it down. It's get going and get moving forward. And that's really what I took out of that very beginning.
Yeah, I remember reading the book, and as I started to reread it, some things kind of came back to me. Other things not as much. I know it's been 10 years, but I expected it to be more familiar for some reason. And like you ever, like Dan, you and I have talked about this in the past. Like you're a really good test taker, right? Like you know how to either cram or prepare for a test in a manner that you may have no recollection of what the actual information. And I'm not not to be judgy. We talked about this. Like in high school, like I struggled with like tests and stuff like that. So I was always kind of like an average student, and I think you had really good grades for the most part. And it was because you had self kind of proclaimed to be a good test taker.
Yeah, well, I would couch that and said I had like okay grades.
Okay.
with no effort.
Yeah.
But I was able to take tests and, as it goes, my parents said I had to get B's.
Yeah.
So I always got A's or B's but literally didn't bring books home. I didn't do anything. And I was able to get A's and B's. I have a knack for taking tests and giving answers that suffice to satisfy people.
Yeah. To me, this sort of reminded me of why we did it, right? When you asked us to read the book for the first time, it was a little bit in preparation for some of those strategic planning meetings that we had never done. And I don't know if I was like cramming for a test or what, but like a lot of it felt like I remember reading the book. I remember the purpose of why we did it, but it was like the test was over, right? Like we had the meeting. Yeah. I had moved on from.
You got rid of that,
and that space was
cleared out.
Reclaimed. He redid the hard drive on that space.
Yeah. So one of like the first things that struck me, and I think it might have even been in the foreword, and I was like, it was like do this at least once a year, and I was like, good Lord, like I skipped like recommendation number 1, 10 years later, finally reading it again, and I was like, okay, I missed the mark on that one for sure.
Well, and I feel like just personality wise, like I would never do that. Like I would remember that he said to read it and be like, I'm not doing that. Like, I mean, but the thing that struck me is I remembered reading the book, and I remembered a lot of what they said in the foreword in the beginning. I've read a little bit more of it. But I think what really struck me was it came off different the second time. I was reading it from a different spot because I feel like when I read it the first time, sort of just pure ignorance. I didn't know what I didn't know. I had virtually no fear that anything could go wrong. I didn't have the good sense to know the risks that were there. And I still say Ford and I are good at evaluating risk, but I look at it differently now. So I definitely looked at it from the perspective of that you're taking something that's good, but you could be better, right? And sort of at that point, it spoke to me about just be better tomorrow than you are today, right? We're already good.
Sure.
When I read it this time, I read it like, okay, we've put ourselves in a situation that we need to work out of now. I have clear things that I believe can be fixed to make us run better. And the first time I read it, I don't know that I had that. The first time that I read it, I think I said, like, we're pretty good right now.
Mm-hmm.
But it struck me that we could be better. Like, is good enough? You know, almost going back to that idea of me in school. Like, it's great that you can get B's, but is that as good as you can be? Or, you know, or could you be better?
Yeah. And
this time I looked at it and I read it and I said, like, okay, we have found things that we need to be better at for our own good. And so that's the spot I read it from. So for me, I do remember it, but it was coming from two wildly different places of what I was reading that book and what I was reading into and getting out of it.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know, Ford, did you feel it was the same or?
I mean, I think that is the epitome you're saying. Like before it was like, okay, just add fuel to the fire. And now it's a little bit different because it's like, you know, we are ready to go back and, you know, take names and, you know, hit stuff. Like that's where we are. You know, we've trimmed some of the tree's been trimmed a little bit of some things, people that were not fully performing to join us. And so it's like time to really like, it feels like we're back at that same spot, but we're in a different spot as kind of what you're saying.
Yes.
It's like, we're at that same spot where it's time to just like lock it in low and go. And at that point, like we were at capacity
we thought
of what we were doing.
Right. Yeah. And that is part of the book. So when Ford mentions, you know, pruning the tree, like that's one of the points of the book that I'm this is where I'm bad at it. If you say like what page is it on, I have no idea. Yeah. But pruning the tree is one of the things of, you know, right away and all at once is that you can't be better if you don't prune the tree. If you don't prune it so that it's healthy and it can grow, you don't allow growth. And the biggest point of the book that I took away then, and I think as we read it, I will probably take away now, is that growth is key, which is partly personality, right? Like in other words, partly I'm always going to look at things that way, that the best way to fix something is more, right? Like more will definitely fix it. But the book sort of tones you down, even though it encourages it. Like it encourages the behavior that more and growth will make things better, but it has to be intelligent growth that's managed.
Right.
You know, so it's helpful for me with my personality because I know that. And I can look at it and say like, okay, yes, we need to grow, but in order to grow, do we actually need to prune this thing a little bit so that it can grow in a healthy manner and not just be a gigantic mess that you can't manage?
Sure. Yeah. He uses a term in there, and as you're talking, I was like trying to grab it in my head, and it's like chronically underperforming or something like that, right? Yeah. Like, do either of you remember what it is? Is that doesn't feel right, but it's something like that.
Yeah, it's not chronically underperforming, but that is the gist of it, is companies that
are just happy doing what they do.
Yeah, they just do what they do, and then they are successful numerically, like statistically, they are okay,
fine,
and they are healthy.
Yeah,
but they are not achieving anywhere near what they're capable of. And that in the book they would say that like immediately becomes the target of the activist investor, which has become a modern day thing with venture capital and other things where you're looking at, you take a company and, you know, and we're not going to do it, but we could apply this to things that Ford has done in his lifetime as a entrepreneur looking at items, is when you look at a company and you say like, this is a good company and it's doing well, but it's just doing what it's doing. And it's just like rinse and repeat. It's just going to keep doing the same thing. And so it can make X dollars with X amount of employees and have an X footprint. But what if it didn't? Like, what if it made 5X of what it does because it had 5 times as many and 5, you know, and there's that growth that, right, like that you see. But that doesn't necessarily happen just by growing, right? Like, in other words, there has to be some things that change. Otherwise, it would just stay the same.
Yeah.
And so, but I don't recall, I know exactly what you're talking about, but I do not recall their term for a company that is like historically, or I think chronically might be the right part, but I think the other part of the word is not right. But they underperform. It's an underperforming company, but it's a funny thing because they say underperforming. They don't actually mean that it's not healthy.
Right.
They mean that it is not performing at the capacity that it could if it took advantage of the market that is available.
Right. Or without any like, strategic growth or a growth mindset, right? Like if you have no interest in doing better, right? And it doesn't have to be more, but a lot of times it is more. But if you have no interest in actually doing better, then you just are content with getting what you've always gotten. And that's what the activist investor is exactly what they started talking about, because it's like, all right, well, which would you prefer? Would you prefer to be your own investor? You figure out how to grow and maximize the potential of your company. Or do you want to be, especially in a publicly traded company, which we are not, but in a publicly traded company, do you want to become subject to this activist investor type mentality where people see that underperforming nature?
They see opportunity, right? Because that's the irony, is underperforming behavior is also synonymous with opportunity.
Right.
It is opportunity, and it's something we have to decide. I think, and Ford and I talked about this offline. It's something we're going to have to decide over the next, period of time, is what do we talk about in the podcast in terms of what's the breadth, right? What are we talking about? Are we talking about Berg? Are we talking about more than just Berg? What are we talking about? But it is one of the things, like when we talk about what we've done with some of the abilities that you and Tracy and Kelsey and Aubrey and Tori bring to the table, that we're able to do more things and we can help more people and we can replicate something that we think we've gotten pretty good at internally as Berg, right? And it really speaks to this book. In the book talks about that he uses a number of 4x, that you can be 4 times more successful in growth than you can in cost savings. And so that is always the balance that I think we never really put words to it, but it's interesting that this book does it for your and I, the responsibility of Dan and the responsibility of Brian. And the responsibility of Brian is really to keep the company running from a healthy fiscal standpoint, warn us when we're doing things that are potentially risky or dangerous to us, but also to ensure that our costs are in line, that we're not like out of line. Is our G&A still X? You know what I mean? What are all these numbers that we don't really see that aren't daily opportunities? Whereas my piece is to go find more. Let's find more work doing what we do with people we like, that in environments we like, where we can be successful, and we'll get more money and we'll get more top line and we'll get more employees and we'll be able to reward the employees more. And it's self-fulfilling, and it's something that you and I always work through. Is I almost at times feel like I get to do the fun part and you have to do the other part. You know what I mean? Like if we were like parenting, like I get to be the good fun parent and you have to be the unfun parent. You know what I mean? And it's something that you and I talk about, and like we bounce ideas off of each other more than people realize, because once I started to read the book, that's where it started. Like before that, we didn't do that as much. The relationship wasn't as strong. It wasn't as developed. But the other thing was the book gave us that guidance that you can't do one without the other. Like we can't just wildly grow with no real plan for what the pruning looks like. So whatever you want to call that language of what has to happen, that's really where the interaction between the three of us really occurs the most. Is that interaction of understanding, where are we trying to grow? Then how do we get that growth? And then how do we manage everything around what that growth is? Because, if we go out and we look at a contract and we grow the company by 10%, right? Well, okay, so that's 10%. So then everything can grow by 10%. But did I need to grow everything by 10%, right? Or can you look at it and say, Dan, we can do that, but it's not going to cost us more here. But how are you going to fund that, the things that are necessary, and have you thought about it?
Yeah, and that's like a clickbait type conversation there, right? Because it grew us by 10%, but grew us where by 10%, which is sometimes the argument. It's not even an argument. Sometimes where the conversation goes. And what do you mean by where? If we could do 10% more revenue and make 0% more money, is that a wise way to grow? That's
not so good,
right? And so, I think that where did we grow by 10%, or where do we want to grow by 10%
and why?
Is a lot of times what should be the driver, right? And why? Yeah, and why? I think the conversation that you and I have a lot, and it's something that is a healthy balance, is how do we get to where we want to go, and do we have the right timeline and the right funding, right?
Yeah.
And that's always, I think the three of us have that conversation a lot.
Welcome to construction.
Because I think at times the fun part, I think all of it's actually a lot of fun, truthfully. And you guys don't necessarily see the piece that I do as fun, even though I
have a different sense of fun.
Even though
at times.
I enjoy it. Yeah, it's problem solving. It's like playing a game, right? But how do we accommodate both things and make sure we do it in a healthy manner? So the balance, the fortress balance sheet.
We didn't know about that, right? Like we didn't know about that when we read it the first time.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, it was a theory, you know. It was, and not that it's a theory. I don't mean that in an insulting way. Like we hadn't experienced it, is what I should say.
Yeah.
Right. Like it was not an experience that we even though we thought we understood it and we thought we had experienced it, we actually had not. I mean, the other thing that struck me really from this book. So first, biggest piece was that I felt like I was reading it from a different position.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that really struck me, and it's funny, I have said it in different ways over the last 5 years without knowing where it came from, right? Which is almost a hallmark of me. Like I feel like Ford, and actually it happened with this book. He was like, hey, I want to talk about that book. And he like started describing this book. I had no idea what book I have all the books we've talked about it on they're behind my desk.
Yeah, on your shelf.
I couldn't even figure out which book to grab. And he had given me a fair amount of information that was, if I remembered the book.
Minus the author and the title.
Right, minus the things that, right, then I would say, if you had said Get Right Away All at Once, oh yeah, there it is. If you had said by this author, fine. If you had said the book with the blue cover, I could have gotten it. But when you gave me all the descriptions.
Does yours have a blue cover?
Well, it doesn't have a blue spine or something. Well, the book is blue.
The
book is blue.
Oh.
And then,
I was like, mine is not.
No, yours is white.
Are we reading a different book?
This explains the problem.
Oh, now I see.
Now I see. The other thing that I really got from it when I started to read it again was we've been talking about doing jobs that make sense, right? Yeah. And I had talked about that, you know, we didn't forget how to make money. We started to do things which we figured out really, really good ways to lose money or to not make money. And this book really harps on doing the thing that you do well, right?
Yeah,
like
right.
It sounds so simple, but if somebody like sat in a room and you said, I'd like to be more successful. And they say, okay, well, the first step is don't do things that make you unsuccessful. And you're like, yeah, obviously I know that. Except when you're bidding work and trying to win work, it doesn't look that way. It's not that simple.
Sure.
You know, you like look at it and like, this is a good opportunity, but likely just because it's more.
Yeah.
Right. Not because you actually looked at it and said, is this a good opportunity? You know, it's so odd.
You're totally right. I mean, that's the interesting piece about like the where do you grow, right? Because like if you're talking about winning more work, I don't want to ever suggest that winning more work is easy, but if you just decided you wanted to win any type of work anywhere, that would be less difficult than you know, maybe trying to do some of the other things, right? So because in that regard, like you would just be kind of like a shotgun type approach, right? You would say like, all right, well, there's work there, grab it. There's work there, grab it. There's work out there, grab it. But it may not be things that we're good at, or may not be things that are in areas we want to do, or with people we want to work with, or you know, things that we have the right equipment for, or whatever it might be.
There's any number of things. The timing of it, the location, you know what I mean? And it's been really weird over the past, I don't know, 2 weeks. Dylan and I, on multiple occasions, he's walked into my office and said like, hey, like here's, you know, we meet once a week specifically to look at commercial and landfill industrial bidding schedule.
Mm-hmm.
And be like, we have a little bit of a build up here. It's a bit of a rub, a problem. And initially it started out, we'd have this meetings and it was what piece I was going to take, right? So I'm going to jump back into bidding this thing because we don't have capacity. But actually over the last couple weeks since we talked about it and I started to look at the book, he came to me and he said it and I was like, yeah, we're not going to bid that. And he was like, well, why? And I was like, well, I mean, yes, it is what we do and it is in a place we like and it's a job I'd like. So like I got all three things. But I tried to look at it like from what the guidance that the book provides and the experience that he has and says, but there's this one thing that I don't like about the job at all. You know, and it could be a client, it could be timing, it could be location, it could be any number of things. But there's been 3 or 4 jobs that if I brought them up, and we're not going to do that because we tried not to do that. But if I brought them up, you guys would say, well, yeah, you're definitely going to bid that. And you might even say, okay, you might not bid it, but here's why, right? But I don't think it would necessarily be the reason that I actually went after, because I'm really trying to say, like, if I win a job, I want it to be that you won, right? So winning a job does not mean you sign a contract, right? Like Ford always says you don't have it until the ink's dry, right? Like once we're on site.
So the iron's on the job.
When the iron is on the job, that's when you've won the job. But I almost want to have like different language, right? Because it's not like we could win any job. You know what I mean? Like,
you could be awarded any job.
We could be awarded any job.
But did you win?
Did you win?
Yeah.
Right. Like, in other words, because the scariest thing is when you look back years later and realize that you actually lost.
Right.
You know, like, in other words, it'd be like if you played a game and you get to the end and you're like, we won, and you're celebrating, you go out to have dinner with everybody and you're all celebrating, and all of a sudden somebody hands you a newspaper and you lost.
Yeah.
But you didn't know it until someone else told you, because you didn't even understand the game, and you didn't realize the cost, and that's what's funny about it is in our business, it's a question. Cost is the right word.
Sure.
Like, what does it cost you? Not just in terms of dollars, but people, culture, morale, equipment usage, like all these things. What did you give up to get what you got? And did you give up less than you got? If you did, then you won. And if you didn't, then you lost.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to believe that from the first, whatever it is, 70, 80 pages of that book, I can get that much. But I think it's why Ford said, like, let's do this, because he read it and he got sort of, you didn't say anything. You just said, read it. And then after I read it, you were like, what do you think? And I was like, it kind of hit me. Like, what are we doing here? Like, did we forget these things? Especially as we reference them, right?
Sure.
Like, that's the craziest part, is it'd be like, if you make all these references to the thing, but you're not doing step one. And in like a crazy way that I'll make an analogy, I had to get my snowblower fixed and didn't do it in time, or pick it up in time that I could actually use it. So when we got home from skiing, I shoveled the whole driveway with the girls. But before I got it fixed, I pulled out, the package that I got when I purchased it. And I purchased it from Frames. They're local, really good, super thorough, everything else. Literally first, before it tells me how much the machine costs, it says, don't do 4 things. I think I did all 4 things that it said not to do.
I was going to bend down and say 3 out of 4.
Maybe I didn't do 4. I guess I put the right fuel in.
But then you let it sit there.
But then I let it sit there. But in my head, I was like, oh, come on now. Yeah. Like before I even read it, everyone was like, well, what's wrong? I was like, well, the fuel went bad. And I was like, but it's weird, because I used the real fuel, not ethanol, treated. Should have been good for the year. And she was like, well, when was the last time you used it? And I was like, well, I guess it wasn't last year. It didn't snow. And all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute. This could have been 2 or 3 years ago. And so I knew right away what my mistake was, but literally I got the book and I was just getting it to get the number to call them, because I was so frustrated, because I had tried to clean the carb, it wasn't working. And I called them. They knew right away what they had to do. But literally all I had to do was the first 4 things it said, and I would have never had the problem. And that's how I felt with the book. Like, you read the first pages and you're like, if I just would have followed the directions, read the book again, I probably would have noticed this in time to have some impact more advantageously in terms of time.
But I think the key to this at this point is it gives us a good parameter to check what's happened. But I think my mindset with it is, all right, that's dead. That's done. Let's go again. Right. Like, I mean, because you can compare it against all the things that have happened. Like, which hindsight is always 20/20. Nothing else is. But it's like, all right, it's time to fire up and roll out again. And like, let's reuse this because it was functional to us the first time and get it to get us back into the place where our DNA of how we do things.
Well, and more importantly to me is to take that one step further and say, I think part of the intent of this is that our team listens to this, some of them, and they're going to hear it and they'll like vicariously get nothing else, our perception of what the book says.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a hope that some of them come to me and say like, hey, I read that book, or, hey, can I have your copy of the book so I can read the book? You know what I mean? Because I don't need everybody to go out and buy the book, right?
Sure.
Like we have a few copies. If you want to read it, tell me, and I'll give you my copy once I'm done reading it again. But that, because there's the traction. Like, the traction is not that I remember what the book says.
Yeah.
The traction is that we all know what the book says. And if we buy into that as a process, as a path, then we can all keep each other in check, honest, or help, like however you want to make that language.
And it's also a good explanation, but let's think of a different word, explanatory, of why we're doing certain things.
Yeah.
Because as we've grown and as we've done things, the 3 of us might know, but maybe it didn't get out to everybody. And so if there is this guiding thing, it helps people that have concerns that are not concerned, but the only reason they're concerned is because they don't know and they want to know.
Yeah.
And so this is the kind of thing that like, hey, if they want to read it or they hear what we're saying and why we're doing things, and they can come repeat it, listen back to it or whatever the scenario is, it helps them, fill in some of those gaps that, we try and over communicate, but reality is not everybody hears it in the same manner. So, and if maybe people aren't interested, but if people that are interested are curious why we're doing certain things, this helps kind of get them to easier way to be on understanding of why certain decisions are made.
Yeah. And I actually love, like, in the first section of the book, he talks about that. He says like he wrote it from the mindset of like basically how to evaluate your own business. Right.
And your own self, which was interesting.
But that's what I was about to say. So like he said, it never made any sense to him until he applied it to his own life personally. Right. Like this is like a life thing. So like in some ways it's about being purpose driven with your own intentions. Like if you don't have intentions and you don't have purpose, whether it's in life, business, otherwise, then you're kind of just going to float. You're going to be impacted by whatever impacts you as opposed to trying to create your own path.
Well, and that was the part that struck me most about in the beginning of this book is the application of it on a personal level.
Right.
Right. And I think that I have learned, though I'm not involved in it, the value of what exists in this like Lancaster County area, right? Like the way the people are, the way that they have been impacted by the various religions and work ethic that exists out here. And so how they behave, how they act, what you can expect from them. It is not the same as where I came from, right? Like where I grew up, I'm not making it bad. I'm just saying it's different. It's just different. And it really struck me where I am right now in my life, right? And we talk about all the times. We're literally at the 3 stages of life with lives with our kids. Like your kids, you're 3/4, you're mostly to an empty nester. You are close.
He's
right?
like the 17th tee box.
He's like the 17th tee box at this point. I'm at the turn. I just got like a hot dog. I'm feeling pretty good. And then I saw like I saw the backside. There is a lot of hazards I got to deal with over the next like 5 to 7 holes to try and get through the front of it was awesome. Ford, he's just out of the tee box. You might be on like hole number 2 or 3 here. You got some things going on. So maybe you're at 4. I don't know. But in that scenario, like it was very personal to me when I started to read it this time about the pruning thing from a personal standpoint that like, I have to be careful of who I let be a part of my circle. Because it impacts you. You know what I mean? Like it, and I know what I'm thinking about specifically is about sports, right? With the girls, that I need to make sure I surround myself with people who are neither too high or too low on sports and they don't have to be just like me. They can have different views, but I would like to be surrounded by people who have similar expectations in terms of accountability in that that people, they're going to hold their kids accountable, that if they want to do something, then you're going to do it. And if you don't want to, you don't have to. Yeah. But if you sign up, you're going to do it sort of thing, those sort of behaviors. It's not about where will they play or how far will they go. But I started to realize I was allowing myself to be impacted by other people who I didn't inherently agree with what they said. Like sure. I might like them as a person and I like their kids, but they talk and I'm like, okay, that's not in line with my expectation. And if we're going to interact, you're going to have to know I do not agree with your position. Yeah. And we can talk about it, but your position is not valid to me. I think it's a crazy stance to take. And in a funny way, I didn't even think about it that it was the book. It was just me like realizing like I need to like take a deep breath, step back and manage my interactions and say like, okay, people need to know where I stand so that I'm not, but it was a self-preservation move. It wasn't about trying to get people to believe I was right. I don't care. It was about saying, this is what, I just want my kids to be happy and successful. I will support them in going as far as they'd like to go. That's it. Yeah. If as far as they like to go is middle school, then that's where they go. If it's high school, that's where they go. If it's fortunate enough and they want to and they can play in college, that'd be amazing. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, I don't know, if one of my daughters could somehow play on the U.S. women's national team, I'd be like Jason Kelsey and Travis Kelsey's parents. I'd walk around like George Jefferson. But that's not my call. And so to plan your life around these things, I started to see like, okay, I need to be careful with the circles I'm working in right now and just know who I am and make sure the girls and Aaron and I are all on the same page. And then sort of prune that tree back from a family standpoint, from an interaction standpoint and say like, let's surround ourselves with people who have a similar view and a similar expectation of how you behave as a good person, and just move on from there.
Yeah.
And we may still have to interact with everybody, but we'll know where we stand.
Well,
Right.
that's a
And
real interesting thing. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Cyrus.
no, I loved a little bit how he talked about like the 1-page plan, right? And like, you know, like physically take those things, write down the 3 to 5 things that you have to do that are the most impactful, and then come up with an appropriate timeline, right? And because I think that like, I think it's really easy, like personally, to be so impacted by environment. Like you're talking a little bit about environmental impact, and that happens a lot with youth sports, and like everyone's got a different idea of what it should look like. And if you don't have your own opinion, and not even if you don't have your own opinion, but you don't have your own path and goal and initiative, like you're so heavily influenced just simply by what is around you. And I thought like that was, I'm not like, we talked about this actually right around New Year's. We talked about, I'm not like a big like
New Year's
resolution guy, right? I'm not going to be like, this year I'm going to lose 10 pounds, or like, I don't do that. I would say like I'm goal driven, and I'm certainly task oriented, but I thought that was like really impactful. Like what are like the 3 to 5 things that are the most important, and what is the, like, what are the steps to achieving this? So.
It's so easy. He said this in the book, and it's so true. If I said, tell me everything that is good or bad about anything, you could write a lot.
Sure.
Like if I said like, Brian, tell me what is good about the snow, right?
Yeah.
Like you could write lots of things. It could be personal. It could be business side. It could be travel. It could be, and it could be any number of things. If I said what's bad about it, you could write a million things about what's bad about the snow. Right. But if I said like, tell me the 3 things that would best help you to deal with when it snows. Well, that's much more concrete now. Like we're not all over the place. We're very focused, and again, when I read the book, when I started reading the book, that was part of it again, is like, I feel like there's so much of it that we all internalized and we started doing, but we may have forgotten why we were doing it. Right. And so it lost some of its punch because we were still trying to do it. Like you and I would sit down and like, what's the most important thing that we can do? You know what I mean? Even like make it, you and I look at AR or especially accounts receivable, right? So we're looking at accounts receivable. And so, you give it to me and I look at it and I'm like, okay, well, which are the ones that are a problem, right? So this is the ones that will be the most impactful if we can address it. Let's see if we can address it. And we might check off some and say, listen, Brian, I know this to be impactful, but we're not getting anywhere with this. Let's focus our energies. So we're doing the exact thing, right? We're identifying the 3 to 5 things that we could do that would most impact the situation on an AR, right? But we're not inherently thinking about why. We just started to do the thing. And I think that's the value in rereading the book, is to get back to the why you're doing it. Like, I'm doing it because that's going to make a change. But that also means if I'm going to do that, I have to get a change. It isn't enough to just say, yep, Brian, these 3 things, they are very important. You know what I mean? Like, yes, we've circled them, we highlighted them, we both know it's the 3 things.
Yeah.
Then the next week or next month, we go highlight the 3 things again. Like, that's great. You identified the 3 things that we're going to make a change.
Yeah.
It is still important. It is still a problem.
Yeah.
Like all you did was identify it. And that's what happened as we sort of lost our way with the book, was as we started to do the things with the rocks, which, right, like it's similar.
Yeah.
Right. And Ford makes jokes about it, that we would deal with the rocks about an hour before we had a meeting and be like, okay, what were we supposed to do over the last 30 days? Did you do it? No. Okay. What can we, how can we manipulate this so it looks like we achieved something and we set a new goal?
Right.
It's pending.
It's pending. Right. And so it lost its punch over time because we stopped doing it. But I think it's
not being about the doing it and more about like satisfying the list.
The requirement of having a list.
Like the meeting's going to happen, so I better say that I did something, as opposed to like
doing something.
This is the important thing. Why am I not devoting my time to it instead of?
Yeah. And thank you. And that's sort of the point I was trying to get to, is it's easy to make a long list of everything you have to do.
Yeah.
It is harder to make a short list. It is really hard to make a list and then achieve or meet the tasks that you set.
Right.
But if you do it, it is impactful.
Yeah.
And you don't have to do it all. You know what I mean? Like, in other words, like, let's say you set 3 tasks.
Yeah.
If you take care of one task, well, You may not have gotten all 3 done, but the one task, the one lever that you pulled in his language would make a difference. Now, it would be better if you could pull 2,
Sure.
but you could pull the second lever next month. But if you just sit there and stare at these 3 levers and try and figure out how to pull them, you get nowhere.
Well, I do love too that he talked about. So, I mean, there is like in the 3 to 5 steps, there is like a little bit of an immediacy, right?
Yes.
You know, the right away, all at once, like the 3 to 5 things that you can do now,
Right away.
But I do love, like, especially in a business sense, but I think this is true in a personal sense too. Like in each one of these situations, there are going to be some things that you got to tackle on your own, right? But not necessarily all of it has to be done alone, right? And I do think that, like, as human beings, we were made to do life together, right? I think that's evident in a lot of different ways. Whether it's from a religious background or a social background, or, you know, there's a ton of research about why humans are supposed to be together.
Or when everybody wears Eagles hats.
Yeah, you know. Could
you find any green? I was in Central PA, and everybody had green on.
Everybody had green.
They
on?
had converted.
Well, I have a kid who lives in Philly, so he was up late last night.
Oh yeah.
Anyways, but I think that, like, along those lines, like, doing life together sometimes means like who can you, like, pull in to what it is you're trying to accomplish. And he says it in the book, like, take those 3 to 5 things. What are the things that you personally must be responsible for, must have your hands on? But are there things that you can say, like, hey, can you help me? Can you come alongside me? Can we do this together? And if it's personal, that might be close friends or family. If it's in a business sense, it might be other members of your team, or other, like, trade partners potentially that you can lean into and stuff like that. So I just love that while there is immediacy and urgency to it, he doesn't ever once say, like, you have to own it, but you don't have to necessarily, like, be overwhelmed by the 3 to 5 things. You've got to, like, figure out the right way to get it done.
Well, 2 things that we can make their own podcasts out, but the whole friend thing is interesting. What you said about pruning or whatever, there's all those sayings that, like, the 10 people you hang around or how you're going to be, or, whatever scenario is.
Yeah.
And, I'm blessed. I grew up in this community. So, like, I still have friends from junior high or even younger. And then we get to meet a lot of very interesting people in the places we go, and the people, which book?
The places you'll go.
Yes, we reference that a lot,
Dr.
right?
Like,
it's amazing how you meet interesting people. And that's always a tough one for me, because I still trust my base group, even though, because, like, we've all met people that, like, literally are constantly changing their group to try and, like, improve themselves or something, we'll call it. And you're just like,
yeah,
you're phony as a $3 bill. Like, come on. Like, you can't, like, people read too much into that whole thing about, like, well, you'll be whatever this is. And they're like, well, I want to hang out with these people. And it's like, you have nothing in common with those people, but you're just trying to make up some social or economical ladder. And that's your only target for trying to actually make new acquaintances. And, I think sometimes that the cool part is if you just let it naturally go, life changes, but there is new people that might come into your life for a while, might stay, might not. It just depends on the person. But then the second piece was, like, we started this part of this, what's the fancy word now? Stratox, or, strategic, blah, blah, blah. They make, code words for it. Can't say strategic, get to say strat.
all right.
But I was listening to.
I didn't read that piece.
Yeah, no, that actually came out of a couple other things I was listening to.
Okay.
One was from Eric Ritchie and the boys up at Sargent, and they were talking about, they were doing strategic stuff 20 years out.
Yeah.
Now, worry about today, then 6 months, and, like, that was the huge thing for us when we started this book back the first time, was that, like, we were all in the daily grind, and we picked our head up and we were able to kind of get some things going, and then we've achieved those things, and now it's time to, further out. It's constantly looking out.
The base of where we are now is so different. Like, if we really sat down, which I feel like will happen now. I feel like reading the book will facilitate us actually sitting down and doing it again. It would be it will be an interesting conversation when it happens now, right? Because when we first did it, we put goals that were 4x right? 3-4x time, 3 to 4 times what we were. We were like, if we could grow to this in time X, that can't be the meeting. Like, in other words, that it just can't, because it will break the covenant of what we believe Berg is supposed to be and is meant to be in the community, in the sense as an employer, all of those things. Like, I don't think we can go 3 to 4x and still be that thing. I think we would be something else, and the something else could be good, but it's not what we planned for it to be. So it would be a systemic change in what we think Berg, what we want it to be. And I don't think that's where it would go. I could be wrong, when we have the meeting, but I feel like it's going to be interesting because it's going to be so much more about doing the work we want to do. Like getting to the point where the work we do, which has some total value, which will yield us having a certain amount of employees, right? And you can get into all the back end math that you can work, FTEs, and you can work revenue dollars, and you can work all these things to yield a reward for the team that we feel is fair and worth doing. That the answer is not a multiplier. The answer is, how do you prune it so that we're working for great partners who we really enjoy working with, who want to have our services, and that's the pruning. Like, so in that sense, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we are the company that is now just needs to be performing. Maybe I'm completely backwards. Maybe I read it the first time and thought, I brought New Jersey with me and thought, we're great. We just got to be a little better. And I read it now and I'm like, okay, we have to now fix what we know we need to, because this is how we become great again. But maybe it's actually backwards. Maybe in the first place when we read it, we were just trying to figure it out and we didn't have an idea really or a plan. And so while we weren't doing poorly, we just were going wherever we were going, like a chip on the water. Whereas now we are just performing at the level we're performing, and we need to get to be great. And maybe maybe I read it and it's completely backwards. As I think about it, that really we are exactly that. We have all the tools in place that we need, because I think we do. I think we have the leadership. I think we have the base team. I think the team will have to grow a little bit back to numbers that are more like they were a few years back, because I think we need to get to certain numbers, in terms of crews. I think we need to have a certain amount of crews to make this go. But for me, it's about pruning now. It's about finding the right X amount of jobs in the right location, and let's go do that work, because it will go well, because you're working with people you like in places you like, doing things that you do. And you do that, and what the book predicts will happen. And so that's the part that really got me as I started to read it, was we're right there. Like, nothing's changed. Let's go do this thing. And it's just as exciting now as it was then. The challenge is just as exciting.
Yeah, that's cool. I think it'll be interesting to see as we continue to talk about this for the next couple of weeks here. Like how that fleshes out, like, as we start to all formulate our own opinions and then get together as a group and hash them out. I think that'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah. Basically having a strategic meeting right in front of you.
Right in front of you.
Live.
And the crazy thing, Bryce, as I think about it,
yeah.
and we're sitting here and we're doing a podcast about a book.
Yeah.
Now, when I was in school, the podcast didn't exist. They did have books. But I literally, I feel like if you could find, first name that comes to mind is Miss Danaluzzi. That was my senior language arts teacher. This lady crucified me. I ended up in the vice principal's office, legitimately having to answer questions about what I had written in a paper that I had written, because, I'm pretty sure I remember this almost exactly right. Whatever she did, the grading of the entire fourth marking period was 90% this paper. Right? So I've always been pretty good at math. If I get it 90% right, I get a 90. That's an A or B. That's exactly what I was supposed to get. That means I have to physically do nothing the rest of the time. So from, the beginning of baseball season to the end of the year, I did
actually be 84%.
Brian, that's still a B for it, and apparently my math wasn't, so it was what it was. But
90% of 90% is not.
Well, no, I was going to get 100% of it.
100% of 90.
I was going to do really well on this one thing, and I was going to get 90% of it. And I had done the math that I'd end up with an 84 for the year, a B, if I did absolutely nothing and got like a 92 on this paper. And I wrote an outstanding paper. And the woman did not believe I wrote it. She thought I had there was no internet yet. She thought I had bought it from somewhere. And so I had tests on it. She would erase words and I had to take tests. And it was ridiculous because I did write the paper. She just couldn't believe that this kid who barely went to class, I didn't bring any of my books to class. I just left them in the locker. And in a really New Jersey jerk way, I just said to her, you built the grading system. I am not going to do anything. I'm not doing my homework. I'm not bringing my books to class. I'm just going to sit here because I have to. And then I'm going to get an A on your paper. And I'm going to get a B. And she was furious. And it is so striking to me that I'm sitting here doing a podcast about reading a book that I've actually read and will read again. The irony of it is something that just takes me back. To think that now I would do that. And I don't know how you feel about it, because like you've said, you had to work. So I feel like you would put in effort as Brian always does, and you'd be super prepared. So not surprising that Brian would do a podcast on books. And Ford has read every book on the planet, I think, at least once. So
you have to tune into his other channel called Only Books.
Yeah. Only Books. Whereas me, I don't,
A homeschooler that reads books. Isn't that a dichotomy?
Yes. I went to school, didn't read books. Ford was homeschooled and did read books. So there's more than one path.
That is true. And we will continue talking about it on a future episode. So thanks for joining us today, folks. We hope you got something from this, and we hope you stick around to figure out the rest of it.